Hello, in this video I want to answer the question, who was right, Trotsky or Stalin? And when I ask this question, I am not implying that today we need Trotskyism or Stalinism. I am simply asking a question for that particular time and place, who was right, whose policies were in the interest of the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. And contrary to many naive people on the left, I actually think that Stalin was a better politician. He wasn't a better person, he was definitely more psychotic and sadistic and tyrannical than Trotsky, but he was a realist, unlike Trotsky, who was in many aspects an idealist, and his policies, I believe, would have been worse for both the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. So let me explain why. There are primarily two very important areas in which I think that Stalin was actually better than Trotsky. Primarily foreign policy. So Trotsky claimed that he believes in this doctrine of permanent revolution. That means that Soviets have a duty to spread the revolution all around the world. And Stalin, on the other hand, was an isolationist, or at least he claimed he was. And even if Trotsky and Stalin actually in reality agreed on some very important foreign policy questions, for example, they both wanted to spread communism to China, and they both invested a lot of resources, they both wanted to invest a lot of resources into helping Mao Zedong and the Chinese communists. But the fact that Stalin claimed he's an isolationist made it possible for the Soviets to establish diplomatic relations with Western powers. And it also helped at least some people in the West to realize that Stalin is a lesser evil than Hitler. On the other hand, Trotsky had some pretty crazy ideas about Soviet education. So as a philosopher, Trotsky really liked that old Plato's idea that can be found in Plato's Utopia, where Plato argues that children should be taken away from the parents and raised by the state, and Stalin was against it. Stalin was more of a traditionalist in this manner, and he said no, we should preserve the stable family structure of the Soviet Union, and he later even outlawed abortion. So Stalin still believed in traditional stable family structures, and his position was more popular in the Central Committee of the Soviet Union, as was his position about first building socialism in one country and then potentially spreading it to some other countries. But Stalin famously said, if communism will succeed anywhere else from the Soviet Union, it is going to be in China. And Trotsky and Stalin disagreed about whether or not there should be a communist sponsored rebellion in the Weimar Republic by the Soviet Union. Stalin said no, communism simply can't succeed in developed countries of Western Europe, while Trotsky actually volunteered and asked the Central Committee to let him go to the Weimar Republic in order to try and cause a revolution. But okay, as we know, today Stalin was actually right. China and less developed countries were actually the only countries in which communism came to power, unlike the Weimar Republic. I mean, later communism was carried on Soviet tanks to Eastern Germany, but yeah, it wasn't what Trotsky had in mind. And also, people on the left that are likely to believe in this myth that Trotsky was a better politician than Stalin, and that it would all be kind of great and not many people would die if it was just somebody other than Stalin. That's a myth that's still popular in some leftist and Marxist circles, and the very same people that will tell you if it was only Trotsky and not Stalin, we wouldn't have the gulags or the massive deaths. Well, I strongly disagree, and these same people will tell you, well, if only Lenin lived longer, we wouldn't have such a dystopian tyranny in the Soviet Union. Well, first of all, Lenin really didn't have a problem with killing millions if that meant that his revolutionary goals will be achieved. He even ordered the Chechens to ethnically cleanse the Cossacks, or at least he didn't prevent them. And Lenin simply died early enough in order for him to be remembered as this idealized hero that actually didn't have to deal with the economic crisis that significantly damaged the Soviet economy in 1928, and Stalin found himself in a very tricky position. There was a lack of food in the Soviet Union in 1928, and for multiple reasons. There was a war scare, and peasants were less likely to sell grain to the state because of the war scare in the Soviet Union, and Stalin was at a crossroad. He realized this system where we have capitalism in the countryside and communism in the cities, it can't succeed, it's not practical, and the Central Committee realized we have two choices. Either go full capitalist mode and become something like China today, or completely eliminate all free market elements in the Soviet economy and go full communist mode. And as you already know, capitalism soon began to crumble because of the Great Depression, and Stalin concluded, therefore, we have to go full communism mode. Capitalism is too unstable. And for that period, he was probably right, because the Soviet Union was the only major power that didn't have massive unemployment in the early 1930s. But his approach then required killing millions of people that didn't want to live on collectivized land, not to mention that unfortunately his policy of collectivizing agriculture got mixed with his anti-religious campaign of closing churches, proclaiming priests to be kulaks, and so on. And the irony is that the Central Committee, they feared a Napoleonic like figure, a Bonapartist figure, seizing all power in the Soviet state and becoming a tyrant. And Trotsky fit this profile much more than Stalin, since Trotsky was a military leader and Stalin was not. But the irony is actually Stalin was the one to turn the Soviet state into this, let's say, dystopian tyranny. But what people often forget, he, for the most part, actually had logical reasons behind it. He realized that the agriculture needs to be collectivized in order for the state not to crumble. And his solution was, well, if people rebel, then either kill them or send them to gulags. And Trotsky would have been faced with the very same obstacle. I mean, Isaac Deutscher, one of the greatest historians of communism, who was a Trotskyist, actually makes this case. He says, well, if you look at Trotsky's writing, he condemns Stalin for killing so many people in the early 1930s. But what is his solution? Would he not collectivize agriculture? What would he do with those that rebel? What would he do with the kulaks, rich peasants? People often forget that Trotsky actually in the early 1920s attacked Stalin at Bukharin. He attacked them as being pro-kulak, pro-capitalist and pro-rich peasantry, because at the time Stalin and Bukharin allowed rich peasants to employ people, to hire them, and Trotsky said that that's capitalism, comrades, and he condemned Stalin and Bukharin. So we have no reasons to believe that Trotsky wouldn't send rich peasants to gulags. And we also have no reason to believe that he wouldn't also violently crush peasant rebellions. Not to mention that a lack of food would exist in both cases, so some people would just have to die. But I would also argue Trotsky's policy of taking children away from the parents, even if that policy never became a reality, the mere fact that he said he believed in it, that would probably cause massive peasant rebellions. Because if we take a closer look at the peasant rebellions in the Soviet Union, we see that the peasants often rebelled for irrational fears. Some of them actually believed that the communists wanted to collectivize all women and stuff like that, which didn't happen. So Trotsky's rhetoric was far more extreme, and at least when it comes to the issue of raising children and family structures, and therefore I could easily imagine even more rebellions happening in the Soviet Union under Trotsky. Here we can see a picture of a peasant rebellion, and here we can see a famous picture that represents the revolutionary ideals of the Soviet Union. And here we can see abstract art that was banned by Stalin in the Soviet Union, and this picture in particular actually represents the alienation that the Soviet people felt under Stalin. They are kind of just faceless figures doing their job, and I believe the very same thing would happen under Trotsky, or perhaps something even worse. And what needs to be said is also that Stalin's methods, while extremely brutal, were actually effective. He did manage to rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union, although by using slave labor and using tyrannical taxation of the peasantry. But if we for a moment assume that Trotsky would be unwilling to use such methods, then there is kind of a uncomfortable question that needs to be asked, and that is, would the Soviets be able to industrialize in time before Hitler attacked them? But okay, let's now also imagine that in the scenario of Trotsky coming to power, there is no Hitler, actually. I first heard Christopher Hitchens make this case. And yeah, and what also needs to be said is that Stalin's policies were actually proven to be, at least at the time, right, by the fact that while there was a huge crisis of capitalism in the West, the Soviet industry was being built and the Soviet Union had full employment. And I'm not even saying that full employment is the most important thing in the world, but if you are preparing for a huge war, then it is. Then you need full employment. But okay, I actually think that Trotsky would probably be able to industrialize the country in one way or another, but his foreign policy was probably the biggest problem. He would probably provoke Western powers into attacking the Soviet Union. And let me explain why. So let us imagine then that in the early 1920s, nobody prevents Trotsky from going to the Weimar Germany and trying to cause a communist takeover. Now, that communist takeover would probably fail, and it would probably result in either Germany becoming some kind of a military dictatorship because they would fear communism too much, and Hitler probably wouldn't then come to power, which in itself is good, but Germany being a military dictatorship probably isn't a good thing, and there would probably be a war between that capitalist military dictatorship and the Soviet Union, and most of Europe would probably support Germany. And yeah, as I already said, I sincerely doubt that Germany would become communist. China was probably the only country, as Stalin said, that at the time had met the conditions necessary for a communist, for a strong communist movement to take over. And yeah, so, and even if communists somehow managed to take power in the Weimar Republic, I think there would almost certainly be a fascist coup against them, probably done by the military that was mostly right-wing and pro-monarchy, Or let us even imagine a scenario in which the communists actually win the elections in the Weimar Republic. Trotsky and Christopher Hitchens make this case. Trotsky was actually not against Stalin's policy of causing a split on the left between communists and social democrats. Trotsky was pro-unity, while Stalin was pro-disunity, and he called the socialists social fascists because they supported colonialism. And Stalin made the case, well, we the communists, we also care about the proletariat of India and Africa, while the socialists don't. And that was actually a pretty strong argument, but one could say at the time the fascists were the bigger enemy and they should have stayed united. So let us imagine for a moment that in the Weimar Republic, social democrats and communists stayed together. And what also needs to be said, the main reason that Stalin started with this policy of disunity on the left is the fact that Chiang Kai-shek destroyed the Canton Commune in China. And the Canton Commune is actually something, a Chinese version of a Paris Commune that was brutally destroyed by the Chinese, let's say, socialists, the Kuomintang movement. And after that, Stalin loses faith in the possibility of having unity with the socialists. And in a bizarre way, one could even make the case that Chiang Kai-shek caused Hitler to win the elections in Weimar Germany, because without the massacre of the Canton Commune, Stalin maybe never starts advocating for this unity on the left. But let's be realistic. Had communists won the elections in the Weimar Republic, either the military or Hitler and his supporters would just proclaim the elections to be invalid and they would attack. And this kind of civil war in Germany would probably, under Trotsky, cause the Soviet Union to enter the war before they were ready. Trotsky would probably send the military to go through Poland, since he already attacked Poland in the past, and he would probably send a lot of military aid and quote-unquote volunteers to fight on the side of the communists in Germany. And in this scenario, I really see even the British and the French siding with the right-wingers in Germany and attacking the Soviet Union. And there is also a strong possibility that imperialistic Japan would attack them from the east and use their weakness at the moment. So to me it really appears that Trotsky would provoke a war with Germany and possibly with Western powers as allies of Germany, because in this scenario Hitler would actually have no time to either come to power or to attack France and start with all the horrible stuff that alienated the Western allies from him, such as killing the Jews and gypsies and all the others he deemed unworthy of life. And what also needs to be said is that in this scenario, if we assume that under Trotsky Nazis would never come to power, which seems actually likely to me in this scenario, to me it seems that Germany would probably become a military dictatorship or a monarchy. Most of the people in the military wanted to return the emperor and make Germany an empire again. And I find it more likely. They would probably just proclaim either a military dictatorship or a monarchy as a response to a failed communist coup that was advocated by Trotsky. And in this scenario, humanity never actually experiences Hitler. And on the surface, that is a good thing. But without this ultimate evil of Hitler, I actually believe that humanity would not learn the right lessons from World War II. Maybe there would be no UN. Maybe we would never proclaim wars of conquest to be immoral. And generally, wars of conquest happened rarely after World War II in all the world. And without a lunatic like Hitler, British and French economies would maybe never be so destabilized, and therefore the colonial oppressed nations would never have the opportunity to free themselves from colonial oppression. And without Soviets seizing massive territories in Eastern Europe, maybe Soviets wouldn't be able to help the colonial people enough for them to win their freedom. So in a bizarre way, I actually do think that World War II and Hitler coming to power in the long run at least, had more positive consequences for humanity than negative. And I do agree with historians such as Margaret Macmillan that actually claim that Hitler in a bizarre way caused the fall of colonialism, and under Trotsky I don't see that happening. I just see another pointless war between communists and capitalists, very much like the First World War. And in what way? In a way that it would be a very morally grey war, a war of two evils fighting for dominance, and therefore we, the humanity, we the people, would not be able to learn proper lessons from it, and we wouldn't be able to proclaim war and fascism as universally evil as we did in our timeline, or at least that's my take on the situation.